Hey! Welcome to DnDTime Talks, the show where we discuss all things dungeons and also dragons. Mostly dungeons tonight. I'm Pete.
Yeah, we're only talking about dungeons tonight, Pete. Today, the one time you got the shtick, the spiel correct.
I always get that right. I never mess that one up. But today is the show where we discuss all things dungeons. I'm Pete. He's Jeremy. We're talking about dungeons.
You fucking took my self-intro.
It's all mine. How you doing, dude?
I am doing pretty well. How about yourself, Pete?
I'm doing well. This is a very exciting topic. This is, 50% of the most quintessential D&D topic that we could ever possibly talk about.
You know what? I think it is.
Indeed. And hello to everyone I see hanging out in chat. I saw Reflected, I saw Frog, I saw Sheba, all chilling. Good to see y'all out there. There was Sheba who said something about making our last couple of talks count. Reflected asked if our topic next week, for the last Wednesday before we go on break, was going to be dragons. And to you, I say, maybe. Who could say for certain? Certainly not I.
That would be awfully convenient theming. I will just be the one to say it for you, Pete. For you, Sheba. Shrug emoji.
Oh God, it's so toxic.
I'm super into this topic. I really like talking about dungeons. I know, Pete, you do too. And chat, I'm sure you guys have plenty to say about dungeons, so feel free to type along in chat. We'll be paying attention and talking about what you're talking about. So yeah, let's dive into the topic, Pete. Let's talk about dungeons.
Let's talk about, when you said let's talk about dungeons, I really was expecting you to say and dragons afterwards.
No.
Because
Pete, we're just talking about dungeons.
Because the word is just so synonymous to me with dragons, but you have to focus. You have to stay locked in on dungeons, and it's a fun one to talk about. We're going to be talking about... Oh, yeah.
If you go into a game, right, and you tell people, oh, yeah, I'm playing dungeons.
That sounds like a much different game.
Oh dear.
Anyway. It's also a game I don't know if I want to. Like, someone's like, oh, we're playing a round of dungeons tonight. Like, maybe I'll sit out. But if you knew how great dungeons are, which we hope to talk about a bit, maybe you would sit in. We're going to be talking about when to use them, where, how, why you use dungeons. And dungeons are really kind of an ancient art form in D&D. They're kind of the reason the game was made in the first place. Dungeon crawling and moving through dungeons was the game when D&D first started. And I think the D&D community has on the whole kind of moved on to a more role-playing and more, storytelling focused direction. But dungeons are just fun. It's just kind of, you turn your brain off and you go through it and you kill some things inside of a dungeon, you pick up some treasure. It's a lot of fun. Sometimes
you can't turn your brain off.
That's true.
Puzzles!
Good dungeon design, you should never be turning your brain off, I suppose. But
way back in the day, when in the days of yore of Dungeons and Dragons, when Pete and I were but concepts in the great ether of the world, dungeon masters, actually, they were called dungeon masters, and they were known for their specific dungeon. A player had like their one dungeon that they ran, and they were known for that dungeon, and that's what they ran. And so like, it's a really interesting concept now role play, right, and NPCs are a bigger factor that DMs are known for. But dungeons are still wicked important for the game.
Yeah.
Which is why we're talking about.
Yeah, the dungeons are the part. Dungeons feel to me very much like the part of Dungeons and Dragons that is still a game.
Absolutely.
Because when you're, walking around talking to a lot of NPCs and doing that sort of stuff, that just feels like improv and storytelling, not like you're playing a game. But hex crawling, or I guess not hex crawling, but dungeon crawling.
Oh, that's a different topic.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
That's another talks.
I pictured moving on a board, though, moving on like a tactical map and going through dungeon tiles and stuff like that. That's very gamey, and it can be a lot of fun, and I love it personally. So let's get into the nitty gritty. Jeremy, do you want to just say what a dungeon is?
Yeah. So before we can really talk much about like how to build a dungeon and all the cool purpose and all everything to a dungeon, we got to talk about like what is a dungeon. And in essence, this isn't 100% true, but a dungeon is a series of rooms planned and laid out by the dungeon master with challenges and other content that is usually pre-planned. It can be anything from 3 rooms in a cave in a mountain, or it can be a very elaborate like castle. Um, Usually, these chambers, these different rooms that are in the dungeon, are segmented or split off from one another by means of walls or some other obstruction.
Yes, but I would say other than that, you can get really abstract with what you would consider a dungeon. It's not just deep within inside the castle. There's a place where prisoners are tortured and kept. No, it can be a ship, can be a dungeon. Going inside like a very massive pirate ship, the chambers and galley and crew quarters could be considered a dungeon. The inside of a creature's stomach with its various kind of like chambers and the internal organs could end up making a dungeon. There's, not really any limits on what you can do with it. You just have to have a few different spaces for you to walk through, really.
I mean, heck, if even if you want a really abstract version of a dungeon, just look at any of our DnDTime events, right? There's a series of obstructions that different groups deal with.
Yeah.
Each of those different obstructions can be effectively another aspect of the dungeon.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on. Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
But yeah, so let's start talking about designing our dungeon. So dungeons, the first thing you really want to think about is why you're using a dungeon, like why you want to include it. Because as Pete mentioned, the game has definitely moved in more role-playing centric environment, which is great. I love role-playing. But so why are you including a dungeon, right? Why are you putting it there?
Yeah.
You got to think of its purpose in the game. So odds are it's either like a story reason, right? It's the villain's lair, or it's somewhere the players have to travel through to get to point B, the place they really want to go. Or perhaps it's just something they stumbled upon, right? Or they know there's something in the dungeon they want, whether it be loot, and I mean, there's another reason, loot, or just XP, right? Players in Dungeons and Dragons get XP by beating up baddies, and that's how they level up. So going into a dungeon, you might be doing that just to get XP, or from a character perspective, maybe it's to protect the town from the goblins, right?
Yes.
It can be any number of reasons.
And that ties into the second purpose, which is thinking about what your dungeon is going to be in the context of the world. What is the place that you're going to? Is it, for example, like Jeremy was just saying, a goblin encampment? Or kind of like a goblin fortress where there's multiple floors and this is where the goblins reside, so you're going there to deal with their leader. You have to think about the in-world reason that the location that they're going to exists. Maybe it's an old ruin, and you don't need to necessarily know a lot about the old ruin in the forest, but you have to think, maybe have a general idea of what this might have been before it became a ruin, and think about what kind of creatures would be attracted to that place, and start to kind of tie it into what you're building in your overall world, and make sure that those two things coincide. So, if you're building a place that you just want to have be kind of an excuse to give loot to the players, you can just maybe think a little bit less about what the purpose of that place is in world, because it doesn't matter as much. It might be just kind of like a random cave that they stumble upon, where somebody buried treasure a long time ago and then they find it when they go in. And there are endless ways to figure out how you want to fit the thing that you want to put into your world. It's just a question of taking a moment and kind of thinking on it and settling on it.
Yeah, so when you're building a dungeon, there are 3 major pieces that go together to build your dungeon, right? There's the combat aspect, right? It's when a player's enter a dungeon, there's probably going to be some combat. They're expecting combat, especially if the dungeon is obvious. Not all dungeons are obvious, but they're expecting combat usually. There's going to be probably some aspect of puzzles, right? Or an intellectual challenge. Something that's meant to test the players more than necessarily their characters. Like riddles, great example. Pete, I know you love your riddles.
I love riddles. What can I say? I made a whole boss once called the Riddle Boy in DnDTime. It was just riddles.
And I mean, these puzzles can be super diverse and complex. I mean, or Riddle Boy, right? Just silly things about colors. They were like color puns and things.
Yeah.
Are fun. And of course, the last part is traps. Something that you don't need to have in your dungeon, but they're frequently included, and they can help the place feel more dangerous and exciting, and give the players another cool obstacle to overcome.
And as one more kind of note on puzzles, because I think a lot of people have a very narrow view on puzzles as it being like, it's a room with all sorts of different switches that have to be pressed in a certain order, or, a creature asking a riddle. Banshee were already there saying, the Sphinx. Yes, of course, you think of the riddle Sphinx. But a puzzle can also be, there's a gap in the floor. You have to get across it. That's testing your players and what they're able to think of. The player deciding like, oh, I'm going to go into my inventory and take out my 10-foot pole, and we're all going to do that and make a little bridge. That's a puzzle, and in effect, something that just kind of makes the players start to think about how they are going to accomplish whatever the goal is. So things like, simple skill challenges and locked doors could even be considered very simple puzzles.
Yeah, I love the locked doors. It's a super simple puzzle. You don't think of it as a puzzle, but there's a door in front of you and it's locked. How are you going to get through it? Right? Players can do the obvious way. I try and kick down the door, but you're going to be loud then, right? There are going to be negative consequences for not doing the puzzle correctly or not beating the puzzle correctly.
Yeah.
And those are really engaging in a deeper way than I think most people think when they think of puzzle. Or not deeper, but a different way.
For sure. So these are kind of the tools that you need. You need to know why you're doing a dungeon. You need to know the kind of general things you're going to put in it. But let's start talking about like actually building a dungeon and what makes it kind of fun, what makes it engaging for players. And I think one of the big things that you're going to want to do is, we've talked about these 3 things you can use: combat, puzzles, and traps. One of the big things is going to be incorporating all of those in some degree. You want to keep the players on their toes. A dungeon where they're going through and every single chamber they walk into, there's a pile of enemies that they have to battle, and then they move into the next one and there's another pile of enemies. That's going to get boring probably by the end of the second room. They're probably going to start to be a little bit like, all right, yeah, I get it. We're going to fight a bunch of stuff. Making sure that you're constantly changing the pace on the players as they move from place to place and chamber to chamber in a dungeon is going to keep them on their toes. It's going to keep them engaged and interested.
Yeah, this kind of variety, right? Mixing the dungeon up with little puzzles and little time trials even can be very cool. Like people saying, pacing. It's just a really engaging way to keep your players engaged in the dungeon.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next kind of thing we need to think about, right? So we've talked about spicing the dungeon up with variety.
And this is a big one.
Well, I think there are 2, right? The theme of the dungeon and the rewards for the dungeon.
Yes.
Certain themes are really straightforward, but when you make a dungeon, you want to make sure it has a consistent tone, or if the tone changes, it at least tells a consistent story. So let's take our Goblin Cave, right? Mm-hmm. With each new chamber they enter and every new threat they encounter, you're going to want to delve deeper into that story of goblins live in this cave. Maybe you find their bedrolls. Maybe you find, some dead goblins or some prisoners, right? Maybe you find a goblin's pet warg tied up in one chamber, where that warg is not a combating because it's just tied up. It can't attack you. But that's an interesting way to make that story a deeper vein.
For sure.
And we're not saying don't put anything random in. Everyone loves random encounter. Well, not everyone. A lot of people love random encounters. But, if it's the Goblin Cave, maybe not put something in there that just eats goblins. Could destroy them.
Or, just a Zorn is there as well without any real reason. Just this big rock golem is also shown up. If you have something like that in there, make sure that you understand yourself why it is in there and find a way to kind of justify its place in the cave. So if you want to throw in something that eats goblins into your goblin cave, then maybe it's caged up somewhere inside of the place, and the goblins keep it there because they captured it because they don't want it roaming the forests. And this is kind of, maybe it's the way they punish their criminals. They throw them into the cage with this goblin-eating beast. And when the players get in there, some of the goblins decide to let it out, and that's a new kind of challenge for you to encounter because now it's just on the wild, and maybe it eats more than just goblins. It's also happy to eat adventurers. and begin beginning to find these kind of stories and intermingling in the way. Because I think designing a dungeon, especially for sentient creatures that inhabit it very intentionally, you can use a lot of the same tools that you would use to build stories in towns and build adventurers and begin building a small society in the dungeon. You can think about how the creatures within live and let their surroundings reflect just the very real ways in which they live.
Yeah, and I mean, for other types of dungeons, right, we talk about the Goblin Cave as a dungeon, but,
The
let's say
quintessential.
like a pirate ship, right? Pete mentioned the interior of a floating, pirate castle, basically, or whatever. A ship so big, it's basically a castle in its own right. You don't want to have, like, a dragon randomly in there, right? Unless there's a reason for it to be there. You don't have a dragon just kind of hanging out in the hold. Hey, I'm a dragon. I don't know why I'm here.
Just roar!
I serve these CR2 pirates because I'm a dumb dragon. No. But yeah, making sure that all of your creatures kind of tie into your tone or your theme is a really cool. Not a cool, but it's immersive, right? It keeps your players engaged, and the verisimilitude of the story is maintained. Nothing is worse than spending all this time getting really into the dungeon, and then suddenly you come into something that just doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
Like, oh, there's a dryad deep in this cave. Why? Why is there a dryad here? This is a goblin cave.
And it's very much not a forest. And this applies not just to the creatures that you put in with, but the whole, the architecture, the story of the dungeon. Let's say that this is an old dwarven stronghold, but since then a bunch of orcs have moved in. You can tell that story through the surroundings and the space. Maybe a lot of the kind of dwarven patterns on the wall have been broken and beaten apart, or covered over in places by the orcish kind of flags that they've laid because they don't want to look at the dwarven architecture in the space. And you can tell a story just with the surroundings there. There's, the players have the opportunity then to look at these things and maybe intuit some of what happened here just by looking at, thinking about the things that you've described in the space, which is the kind of thing, and we've talked about this before, but when your players are able to, fill in the story on their own from description, that feels really good for them, and it means, one, you're doing a good job, but two, it'll feel really good for you as a DM.
Well, and actually, let's fixate on this dwarven stronghold for a minute. I really love that as a concept for a dungeon, right? A lost dwarven stronghold that's been inhabited by X. In this case, we're saying orcs.
Yes.
I really like that because there's a history to the dungeon. Players might intuit and bring in some information they have about dwarves, right? They know
make those stone cutting checks.
Well, they're expert stonesmiths. Maybe the players realize, oh, there might be secret chambers here, which we'll talk about secrets in a second. And they start looking for those, expecting dwarves are smart. They would build escape routes. That's something the orcs might not have thought about. Ways that the players can interact with the dungeons in exciting ways that maybe the monsters don't expect. Yeah. But I also love that you can tie that into rewards. If you have a dungeon that was X, but is now X inhabited by Y, right? You can always have the rewards tie in to what the original creators of the dungeon are. In the case of the Ancient Dwarven Stronghold, right? Yeah, it's inhabited by orcs now, and the orcs don't realize that battle axe being held by the big golden statue above the dwarfs, like in the dwarves' grand hall, is a magic axe.
Is an axe of the dwarvish lords.
They just don't think about it because dumb dwarves, and they maybe they drew dumb faces on the big statue, and they walk by this magic axe every day, but they don't get that because maybe they aren't smart. They aren't smart enough to realize it. Or they just don't care. They'd rather not use it because it's made by dumb dwarves, filthy dwarves, right? And having that kind of loot tie into the theme, I think, is really, really cool.
Yeah, that works really well. And on the subject of something that V Bunny was saying before that I want to go back to because I liked it. Mm-hmm. He was talking about, and when we were talking about puzzles, puzzles that require getting access to a key from a different area and then using it in the right spot. that can be a reward for a player. Just the ability to continue to progress through a dungeon can feel like a reward. That's something that, for anyone familiar with the Zelda series, there's tons of chests and stuff that have keys, and those keys are just used to unlock doors. But as a player, when you find a key, you're like, oh, hell yeah, I found a key. That's really cool. This means something, and I get to do something later with it. So even though, like, technically it's just a gate, you're not really giving them anything, you're just giving them access to the next room, that can still feel really satisfying. I felt that way, Jeremy, when you ran your dungeon recently, and we were in a room with some kind of like slots on the walls, and we were just kind of at a loss, because there were these big wall panels with small divots in them, and it seemed like something went in there, but we weren't sure how to interact with them, and we walked out, and you were like, if you look in the hands of the skeletons that are here in the chamber that you left through, you can see these small spheres. And I was like, oh, hells yeah, now we know the thing that we need. We have the tool to continue moving forward. And I was very excited about that. That kind of, relieving of the frustration of like, man, I don't know what to do here. It was very satisfying. It's a surprisingly effective tool.
But yeah, I mean, I love those little things. They're great. Another thing about treasure is, like, you gotta also consider what kind of treasure you're putting in your dungeon. One of the things I don't like, and Pete, this is like, I'm kind of on a tangent now, but random treasure. How do you feel about random loot?
I don't use random loot ever. Never have.
The issue I have with random loot is, especially if it's like something good, like a cloak of protection, and oh yeah, you beat the bandits and they have a cloak of protection. Why weren't the bandits using the cloak of protection?
Yeah, I always put my loot, I always give equipment to the big bad if I'm going to run sentient creatures, and that's just a more interesting thing. It feels cooler to be like, to take the gear off of the guy that you just beat the hell out of, if you think of it. Also, there's like, I like the idea that they beat the bandit captain, they don't take the really nice cloak of protection off of him, and then when they go to collect the bounty, the guy's like, oh, you didn't collect his cloak of protection? And then they have to go like,
they have to go back.
They have to go back, and then it's gone. Like somebody else has taken it. There's a story there for sure.
Well, and that's great, right? Because then they have to go track down whoever got the cloak of protection because they want it.
Yeah, well, I want this thing. You don't just get to take the thing that we rightfully killed the owner of.
Right.
I mean, you act like every player character wouldn't do exactly that.
But that's great. And I think she was asking, how do you feel about randomly rolled loot? Pete gave his. I actually don't mind it, but I recommend, if you are going to use it, this is my Dungeon Master's tip, roll your loot before. If you know you're going to run a dungeon, right, and you've taken the time to plan out 3 or 4 or 5 rooms for your dungeon, or maybe if you pick a huge dungeon, whatever, and you want to roll the loot beforehand. That way you know where it is, what it is, right, and how you can fit that in thematically. Nothing like... It's great for loot to fit in thematically. Let's say you roll your Belt of Dwarven Kind in this dwarven dungeon, right? And it's just like, there's a big difference between the players are in the throne room and they're looting the horde after, from a chest that the orc had after they beat the orcs, and there's a Belt of Dwarven Kind in there. That's cool. What's cooler is, while they're looting, they notice this gleaming, untarnished by the weight of time belt upon the statue of the dwarf looking down at you.
Yes.
Right. That's just, it feels like, even though it was random, right? You randomly rolled this Belt of Dwarven, because you rolled something that kind of fit in, or that did fit in, right? You can make it work a lot better. Players finding healing potions. Well, what might be a cooler place is than just, it's in the pile of treasure that you find at the end. Maybe instead, right, they find the dwarven vault, right, and that's where the gold is. And they find, and of course the orcs know that, but that's further on. And they find maybe like a hospital chamber, right, or an infirmary, somewhere that the dwarves centuries ago had put their wounded. And wow, the orcs didn't loot this place super well because they don't care about hospitals. And you find the old healing potion. Yes. Finding the loot in different places, I think, can feel really good.
I definitely am a proponent of spreading the loot throughout the dungeon. I think, I generally will always put the really cool thing, like the biggest quote unquote drop is the term you would use in a video game. I always would put that kind of where I intend the dungeon to have its ending or its finale or whatever the last chamber of the room, the most important room of the dungeon ends up being. But I think spreading out the loot throughout the dungeon is something that's really important. And one more thing on the regards of rolling, I think rolling for gold in a dungeon is totally fine, and I do that sometimes. I don't like to roll for my magic items, but rolling for just like more mundane loots and just how much money they pull out, yeah, I think that is totally fine and just an easy way to keep things kind of realistically random.
Yeah, and I like a question in chat from Reflected 10.8.
I loved that too.
About the dormant booby traps.
That's awesome.
I think this is awesome, right? Because if you have traps in your dungeon and you have creatures that are living in the dungeon, one of the things that players hate, and I hate this as a dungeon master, is you get hit by a trap as soon as you get into the dungeon. And then you spend the next 4 hours meticulously searching every chamber that you're walking through for traps. That sucks. It feels bad. It slows down the game. What's a lot more engaging is, so these orcs, right? They know there are traps here, but they don't know how they work, right? They don't know how to disable them. They don't know how to find them. But the orcs know roughly where they are. They know this hallway has traps. So there's no orcs in that hallway. And so Pete described, right, banners covering all the dwarven architecture. Well, you get to this one hallway and there's none of that. There's a nice thick layer of dust upon the ground, right? There's no sign of activity throughout this hallway in the centuries that have passed. Maybe there's like an orc skeleton somewhere down the way where the first orc triggered the trap, and then the other orcs were like, nah, we're going a different way. But I like that.
Crossquill walk to the left.
Yeah, well, and speaking of walking to the left, right? The option of choice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So when we're talking about traps and puzzles, these are things that can be frustrating to players sometimes. I don't know how to get past a trap. I don't know how to disable it. I don't get how it works. This is frustrating. What do I do? Having another option, like Pete just said, Krusk will walk to the left. And that's where all the orcs walk. So there's a bunch of orcs there. A different type of challenge, but one that's more straightforward to the players. This is a really great example of choice in a dungeon, where they could walk down the trapped hallway and deal with the puzzle of how to get through the traps without dying. Or they can go fight the orc.
And then she was bringing up, I think, already bring up one of the most important things about choice, which is the question of choice, or in quotations, choice. And what we're talking about is real choice. And what he means by in quotations choice, I do believe, is the illusion of choice. By having in two directions, like you say, oh, well, you can go to the left path or you can go the right path, but there is no perceivable difference between the two of them, so you don't understand what choice you're making when you make it. You're just picking between two arbitrary constants. So we pick right because we're superstitious about going to the left, so we'll just go to the right. And that's not a choice. It's important to have, anytime you create something that you intend to be taken as a choice, and you want the players to feel engaged in that way by being able to make a decision on which direction they go, you want to have very clear indicators as to what kind of thing they might encounter in this space. Even if it's a trapped hallway versus a non-trapped versus a hallway that's populated by enemies, you don't necessarily know that the hallway to the left is trapped, but they know that the hallway to the left is empty, and they know that when they're going to the right, there are foes there, and then they'll find out it's trapped pretty quickly, probably, but they still have a visual indicator with which to make that choice. And that is definitely really important.
I'm sorry, do you have more?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, another thing I love about choice, so she was saying, oh, wow, all three of these hallways just happen to lead to the same place. And you know what? I see that all the time. And that can be okay. But what I really like is there are 3 hallways, and 2 of them lead to dead ends. And the players figure that out by going down the hallway a little bit. But there are optional rewards for going through those, right? They go down one hallway and it's heavily trapped. But they can see at the end, right, that the entire chamber has like collapsed over there, and they see what looks like an adventurer's body with some very fine looking gear trapped under the rubble. So they can figure out a way past this trapped hallway, or they can just avoid it and not get that loot, right? There's a cool dissonance there where they have that choice of, well, do we want to go do this extra thing? If we do it, that gear might really help us. Or another great thing is if you have a big boss battle, a lair, for example, at the end of your dungeon, maybe having one of the alternate paths give you some sort of benefit. So, leading back to last week when I ran the big dragon's lair, one of the alternate choices that they had was they could have tried to scale up to the broken down balcony. They had an immediate option when I described the first room before they even saw the dragon, where they could have tried to sneak up there, sneak along the balcony, right? It was a different option. There were different threats associated with it. Maybe there was some damage they could have taken. They would have had to roll some checks to climb up there, or maybe use some of their gear to get up there. But that could have given them an advantage. Balconies as alternate entry routes to like big battle chambers are a really nuanced way of, both ways lead to the same place, but if you do this more complicated way, you get an advantage. And players love that. They love that.
Oh, for sure.
Overcame the thing. We took the smarter route. We got an advantage in the fight. And because of that, none of us died. Right? Good feeling.
That kind of idea of kind of finding a trick in the dungeon, that plays very largely into the concept of secrets in dungeons. Because I think every great dungeon should have secrets in it, be they kind of hidden passages or hidden treasures, or things like Jeremy was talking about, where there's just another slightly trickier option where they have to figure something out in order to use it, but it grants them that advantage later on in the combat. That just feels cool as a player, and there's tons of ways to set up secrets that are very easily uncoverable to your players. It might just be that, an investigation, you might make something that's very obviously a little bit out of place in the room, and then when the players choose to kind of investigate it, it triggers whatever your secret is. One of my personal favorites is, if I put something in the room that the players would naturally be drawn to. I think one of the big ones that players often walk towards is a skeleton or something along those lines. I'll say that they'll say, "Oh, I want to go check out that skeleton." When they put their hand through it, I'll say, you find that the skeleton is actually illusory. It was conjured in the space. And that instantly triggers like, oh, this is covering something up. This is something hidden. I want to investigate this further. And once just kind of, you can justify telling them by the secret by, well, if you'd never chosen to investigate that skeleton, you wouldn't have found out about it. But really, whichever skeleton they decided to walk up to first was the one that was illusioned. And you can wiggle things around like that a little bit in order to make sure that your players have an opportunity to interact with these secrets. Because even though they're secrets, if the players don't get to see those secrets, then they don't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really love in dungeons is interconnectivity. So all of your passages maybe eventually lead into the same big chamber because that's where the boss of the dungeon is, right? And that's where the best loot is. But having little things like, as you walk down this, let's say they take that less traveled passage, right? That trap-filled hallway. Even if that just leads to the same place, maybe that hallway has a big crack in the wall, and they can peer through it and see into the final chamber. And then that's a huge advantage, because they're able to look in, see what the big battle area is going to be before they even go there. Maybe they go back and they take a rest and prep different spells, because oh, wow, that was a huge chamber. That's going to be a really good place for me to have my fireballs or my sleep storms, right? Or my spike growth.
I looked up into the huge chamber and it was filled with flames. I need to prepare my fire shield.
Yeah, right? Or seeing an enemy, right? That like, oh, that's an Ifrit, right? That's a fire genie. I should probably not ready fireball for this battle.
Yes,
right?
yes.
These are cool, interesting tidbits that players, little bits of information and tactical advantages that players can get by doing and going these other ways and interacting with your secrets. And it feels good because it gives the players the ability and the opportunity to outthink and
to be clever.
To be clever, basically.
As another kind of fun example of a secret that I ran in a dungeon I ran recently, I had kind of a combat encounter in a relatively simple square room. It was in this sort of frost giant tomb, and the floor was made of ice. And one of the players used a lot of fire magic. And I knew that they did that, so I designed the dungeon in this way so that when they used their fire magic, the ice below would melt, and it revealed kind of a chamber underneath this whole kind of space that had been dug out underneath and around this dungeon. And when they went down into this, they found a bunch of Durgar that were trying to mine their way into the dungeon in order to kind of save the treasure, but the magic that was kind of protecting it wouldn't allow them to get in from the outside, but the players kind of burning it from the inside, they were able to get out to where the Durgar were and kind of go through that way. So now there was kind of like two stories happening in the dungeon, and it gave them kind of an option because I knew up ahead there were some tricky puzzles and things along those lines that they might not be able to overcome. Now they had these one discrete story that felt like it was realistic in the context of this first dungeon, where these Durgar were trying to steal the ancient kind of frost giant treasures, and also a very clear and distinct choice that they felt like they uncovered because of their unique sort of abilities. By using fire magic in the space, they were able to, find this new thing that wouldn't necessarily have been available to them otherwise. So it's kind of like a combination of a lot of those different things we're talking about.
I love what Chiba just said in chat. Wouldn't the water from the melted ice flood the Durgar tunnels? And I think the first result is, well, maybe just not enough melted. But
yeah,
see, when you say something like that, you're thinking like a clever player, because Pete designed this as an alternate choice. And as a player, thinking that and then asking that, because just if you think that, always ask the dungeon master.
Oh yeah.
Right? Ask them, talk through what you're thinking. Because you might have just discovered, okay, actually that Durgar tunnel is just a different puzzle. Because we can fight it without having to battle them. We can just melt all the ice in this room with our fire magic and flood them out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And like, you've just created a puzzle. Not every puzzle is something planned and choreographed by the dungeon master. So many of them are just off the cuff from things players decide to do creatively.
For sure. If my players wanted to do that, I absolutely would have allowed it to happen.
So let's there's one other thing I wanted to mention. When you're planning your dungeon, so Pete and I, obviously, we started with our concept, right? Our dwarven stronghold. And we've been kind of flushing that out as we talk. But you don't have to do that. You can just start with a bullet point of things you want in your dungeon. All right, I want 2 secret things in my dungeon. And one of them will grant a tactical advantage if the players go through it. And one of them will grant some extra loot if they are able to figure it out. And I want a couple branching paths. You can like just...
That's actually kind of what I do.
Yeah, you can think of it in just the abstracts. And then say, once you have your list of bulleted things, right? You have your secrets. You want 2 secrets. One gets you special loot. One gets you one other thing. You have, one trap hallway that maybe leads to special loot. And you have one puzzle, and they need to get through that puzzle or battle a bunch of enemies in order to get to the final thing. Right? You decide on all that, and then you think about what the dungeon is. And you say, all right, so we said the Durgar stronghold, the ancient dwarf stronghold, but you can apply it to anything.
Yeah, there's countless things you could put that formula over.
Hell, apply it to a king's castle, right? Those aren't enemies you normally fight, but maybe a combat encounter would be the equivalent of like convincing the guards that you're supposed to be here, right? That they should let you through, that you have an appointment to meet with this important person. Maybe one of your alternative secrets is, they've cut ventilation shafts into the stone so that it actually vents and doesn't just hotbox the whole castle. And all right, cool. They crawled through these little stone vent tunnels. Like, these are really cool alternate routes, right? Alternate paths and secrets and tidbits that you can just apply the same concept to pretty much anything. And it's really cool to do that. It just feels good.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a very good way to build a dungeon. It's satisfying to kind of have those plans in store for like how much you want to balance your puzzles and your traps and things along those lines. If you want to, do 10% monsters, 10% puzzles, 80% traps.
Team of Horse?
Tomb of Horrors is what the dungeon that I'm talking about, which is a funhouse dungeon, which I would like to talk about in a minute. But before we get to that, I'd like to talk about I'd like to talk about another concept because someone mentioned before. I don't remember who it was, or I think it was actually Shiba who had said, and all of the tunnels lead to the exact same spot at the end, and that can sometimes feel a little bit convenient. So I'm a big fan, and I do this in a lot of dungeons where I will. I know you do the same thing, Jeremy. I think this is a trick I picked up from you, where I'll leave
Little old me.
little old you, Jeremy. You taught me this one, and I'll leave some space at the end of the dungeon. Maybe the place that in the kind of exploration of the dungeon that they arrive at last is not necessarily the end of the dungeon. There might be a lot more cave after the spot in it where the goblins have decided to make their home. And that gives you a few things. One, it feels realistic that not every single time the people are going to settle in the very last space available to them based on where the players happen to walk into the area. So that can make the game just, preserve verisimilitude to a greater degree. But it also leaves you a lot of options for, they've gone through some terrible, terrible encounters. They've had some really rough fights with some hard enemies and they're exhausted. And they beat the boss of whatever this dungeon is. And then there's another door leading down into even more corridors, and they're like, no, later.
No.
We'll come back later.
And that's a really cool point on multi-level dungeons, right? You can have differently themed levels of the dungeon, where you have the Goblin Cave, which is kind of the outer cave. Maybe there's like a river running through that lets out into a waterfall that comes out into the forest. And that's the goblin part of the cave. But the deeper you go, you get away from that. You end up in the more primal earth, right? Where you have
the Underdark.
Exactly, more Underdark creatures like the Umber Hulk or oozes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you probably don't have those as much in the goblin area.
Because they've cleared the few that were there out, and they don't go too much deeper because they don't want to fight oozes either.
But yeah, I like... So we talked about a couple of themes, right? Dungeon theming. Goblin Cave, Durgar Stronghold. You can theme dungeons in way more abstract ways than necessarily that. One of the things I really like, and this is just a personal taste of mine, I love ancient temple kind of things, or ruins, and like a concept like this dungeon was built to protect a thing, right? Or as a ritual for some thing. Mm-hmm. And I like tying the theme of the dungeon into that, so that the players, as they explore, they're learning all of these little discordant bits and pieces that tie into the cohesive theme of the dungeon, so that when they get to the end, there's not a boss fight. They just have figured out the dungeon, and they understand how it works. And that's a very good feeling. I guess one of the examples, I just throwing one out there. So if you tie stuff into... So your players really like D&D, right? They're really into Dungeons & Dragons. They know a lot about lore. And you say, all right, I'm going to have my dungeon themed around the elemental planes. And the players are like, they don't know that. They come into the first room of the dungeon, and it's just all on fucking fire. And they're like, and they don't know what to do, because they're like, there's fire traps everywhere, right? And there's fire symbols and the sun on the walls. And maybe it's a religious thing. And they go into the next room, and the next room is all about smoke. And you just kind of go through the cycle of the elemental planes, and you come to the final one, the final room, and maybe that ties it all together, right? Maybe you find in that last chamber, some sort of elder, primordial shaman of some kind or something, right? That has mastered the ways of the elements that they have to have.
I've control of all 4 elements, the Avatar.
Yeah, I know the whole campaign of Elemental Evil is loosely based on that. Surprise, surprise.
No, who would think?
But picking a cool theme like that that's a little more abstract is also totally fine. Because we said earlier, when something doesn't fit in, players realize that it's jarring. And when it just barely doesn't fit in, like, oh, you're fighting these goblins, and an ooze falls from the ceiling. That's jarring in a way that, like, why is the ooze not killing the goblins, right? Why did it just attack us randomly?
How do they tame this ooze?
Yeah, right. That's jarring in a bad way. But going from a room that's all fire to a room that's all water, that's jarring in a, okay, there's a reason for this kind of way, right? It gets the players thinking, where the dungeon and its layout is a puzzle. I know there's a lot of great themes. The seasons are a very good theme.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the circle of life is a very powerful theme, and you can find these themes all throughout. I mean, history, right? They're super common ideas. The rising sun, right? Setting sun, the rise of the moon, the setting of the moon. These are really interesting and engaging concepts that you can flavor and theme your dungeons around.
And those work really well for the dungeons that are a little bit more grandiose. You don't expect the Goblin Cave to have something like that, but if it's that really big, the lair of a very very powerful being, this seems like the kind of dungeon that. When I'm thinking this, I think this is the perfect lair for a Sphinx, because the Sphinx would want to test the people moving through its space to see if they kind of are able to understand it. Like that feels very right to me.
And I want to take a step back because you said it's not the good place for a goblin. I don't necessarily agree on that. And you're right, because what you said was correct. But you can make it like that, right? Like Pete said, you get to the end of the dungeon and there's more. And the players are like, wait, there's more? They go into a dungeon, into this cave, right? And there are floating rocks just kind of around and a bunch of goblins. Because this cave of elemental earth where the rocks just kind of float.
Oh,
right?
yes.
It's something that it's not a hazard to the goblins, so they've lived here. But they haven't gone any deeper because that's where the fire is, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. And of course, I agree with you on that.
No, I gotcha.
There's
semantics.
You can make anything work in that regard. Just as we can find a way to justify the ooze dropping out of the ceiling from the goblins. It's just a question of thinking about it and finding a way. And that's really the important thing, is making sure that when you're making these choices, consider what it is that you're doing. But before we get
to the end, Goblin Monastery, yes.
But before we get to the end, let's talk about if you don't consider what you're doing and you just want to have the Tomb of Horrors or any of the other dungeons that we would call funhouse dungeons.
I mean, every dungeon used to be a funhouse dungeon.
Those were the glory days when you just put a bunch of things in successive chambers and called it a day. They are, as the first part of that name implies, very fun. But essentially what a funhouse dungeon is, it's a type of dungeon that is a dungeon for its own sake. It's just a series of challenges and puzzles that are not necessarily in any way interconnected or related, except maybe it's like the lich who made them was crazy and just put a bunch of random traps in front. And they're fun. They work really great for one-shots. Sometimes you could even put them into a campaign. And as a matter of fact, if you got a crazy enough lich, you can put them into any campaign. And that's it. It's just a dungeon that you do for fun that has a bunch of unrelated things. And it really lets you, among other things, try out some of your weirder ideas. And they make great one-shots. I recommend the Funhouse Dungeon at some point.
I want to add on to Pete's thing. If you're going to use it in a campaign, I highly recommend forecasting that, like letting it be obvious to the players they're entering into a funhouse dungeon. If they just walk into a cave and suddenly fire spikes shoot out of the wall because you're like, well, there's a lich 20 feet underground in like the third level, or 200 feet underground in the fifth level. That's not fun. That's really frustrating. It's got to make sense to the people coming in. You can't just be like, well, it makes sense if you get to the end and see it all.
There should be like a little more. I definitely wouldn't run one of these as like this is a random place that you walk into on the side of the road. There's just a hole that you can dive into that has this dungeon in it. It should be like, you're going into the lair of the Mad King, and they know that it's going to be something kind of funky going into it.
Yeah, that's all. It's just, I recommend you just let people know.
Yeah,
man. Nothing sucks more than just being totally blindsided, being like, I did not expect this.
And that one doesn't. That one doesn't bother me too much because I feel like if there's some metagame understanding when you're put on a battle map and you now know that you're going for a dungeon. There's kind of that knowledge, like I'm about to be in a situation where there's going to be danger. Like if a spike trap comes out, the first one gets you, and then it's like, well, now at least I know what I'm in for. I paid the troll toll. I definitely recommend, if you're going to run traps, not making your first trap in particularly brutal. Give them kind of a introduction to, there will be some traps in this space, maybe. Don't just have the first trap be the one that's, this one deals 3,000 damage and was a dex save that you did not meet the DC. Your character is dead. I mean, there's a lot more reasons why you shouldn't do that, but
I have a great story. In my first ever game, we entered into a dungeon and we're going through, and I was playing the cleric, so I was in the back because they wanted to protect me. And our rogue was going first, and our rogue was like, "All right, I'm looking for traps." The dungeon master says, "All right, where are you looking?" I'm looking on the ground for pressure plates. All right, you run into razor wire and you take a bunch of damage. Oh, I'm dead.
Just fuck.
That's dead.
That's not fun as a player.
Especially, when you get a player on semantics, that's not good. If they're looking for traps, they're adventurers. They aren't idiots. They've had an adventuring life. They know how to look for traps. They just stare at the ground and walk forward till, that's just not how it works.
Moral of the story, if your DM asks a very leading question, like, I'm looking for traps, what part of the area are you looking? Just say, all parts. I'm looking for them. I'm looking for them everywhere that they might be.
Oh, boy. But yeah, this is Dungeons. I think that pretty much wraps it up. Don't be a dick with your dungeons. Put in cool secrets for your players to discover, and give them some cool optional choices that feel rewarding, both in terms of loot and advantage, or lore. Right, lore is a loot in its own right. We didn't talk about that very much, but all this kind of stuff is cool.
And there's one last note: run dungeons. Actually, put dungeons in your game, because when you get really engrossed in a story and you're spending a lot of time not playing D&D as a game, but playing it as a collaborative storytelling, just kind of improv exercise, which is a great way to play, and I'm not knocking that in any way. A dungeon can just be really a refreshing way for players to have fun in a way that I don't think that heavy role-playing game style can give you in a lot of places. I think the heavy role-playing style can be more rewarding, but I think a dungeon can just be fun. So definitely use dungeons in your games.
Also, one last thing. I know we just said that was the last thing. This is the real last thing. Maybe. When you do put traps in, consider your players a little bit. Consider your party. If you've got that rogue who has expertise in perception, and they've maxed out their wisdom stat for some reason, even though they're a rogue, and they're like, my passive perception is 24, and I took the alert feat. And they're just looking around like, I see every trap. Just seeing a trap doesn't mean you can completely avert it. I recommend considering traps that are a little more engaging than that. Maybe they see a pressure plate and they don't know there are pressure plates further because they can't get close enough to investigate, right?
Mm-hmm.
That way they know, all right, we can't just step over that panel because the next panel might be a pressure plate.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff.
Good trap is also a puzzle, I think.
Yeah, exactly. A good trap is a puzzle. Once they discover it. Otherwise, it's a trap. Until it's discovered, it's a trap.
Once it's discovered, it's
I think that wraps us up for the evening on Dungeons, at least.
Which is going to bring us into our segment, Ask Pete and Jeremy, where people can ask us questions on our Discord server. And we have a massive number of memes today to go through, which I don't think we're going to go through all these memes.
I will go through, I think two meme. I'll go with one meme.
Let's do the first two.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, we're just going to do the first two memes. I was just going to go in order, but if you have one that you're very into.
No, please.
V-Bunny asks, why does everyone only care about themselves anymore? Which is a very heavy question, and the answer is, I don't know, man. I don't know.
Not everyone's like that. There's little sparks of good in the world. Cherish those sparks of good, and let them flow and grow within you, and be good in your own right.
But Jeremy, Reflected 10-8 asks, what is good?
Both casually and
philosophically, yeah.
Good is...
Do you want to do it casually or philosophically? I'll do the other one. You get first pick.
I'll go casually, so you can go philosophically first.
Okay. Oh, I go first.
You
All right.
go first.
Good philosophically is the desire to better the world around you is what I have. That's my answer. I did not study philosophy for a long time, so I don't know. But
You
that,
should have just picked casually. That would have been way easier.
but that's what I got.
Yeah, well, casually. Casually is doing something that makes the world a better place, makes other people happy, which is why I'm going to post a link to World Builders. It's a wonderful charity. They help to get
charity.
people food and stuff. It's a charity that is founded by Patrick Rothfuss, and he's a great guy. I love Pat Rothfuss, and I love his stuff. Highly recommend if you have a little extra money this holiday season, throw it their way. Get some people some sustainable food. You're not just buying them a bucket of water. You're buying them a goat that can make milk and then they live. So it's a good way. You will feel good after you give them even just a couple.
That's a much better answer than what my answer for what is good casually was going to be, which was going to be like, I don't know.
Pete, you can't answer. You already answered philosophically.
Yeah, but I mean, I can do whatever. I have infinite power. I was going to say, like, burritos. I'm a big fan of burritos.
Oh, dude, I love burritos.
That was going to be my answer for that. But then there's a whole pile of memes, and I'm going to scroll past a lot of these memes and get to what do you think of the flat Earth theory? I think it's probably true.
No, we're not going to. No, flat Earth theory is dumb. Here's the thing: even if for some reason you want to refute all science, you can literally prove it to yourself if you're one of those people that has to prove shit to yourself by walking to the ocean and looking and think, oh, I don't see the other side of the ocean. So anyway.
So let's get into the real ones. Rex asks, which one shot was the most fun to write and why?
Fuck. I was gonna look up and think of some. Sorry, you go first.
Ones that were fun to write. The answer to fun to run would be a completely different question. I don't know if I could pick it. But the ones that I really like to write tend to be the ones that are very punny and have a lot of like smaller jokes within them. Or if the ones that I describe as more toy box adventures, where it's a very simple concept with a lot of just little things for the players to do in them. A couple of examples of that. The first adventure I ran with Bloom, I had a blast building that adventure because there was just a lot of small details that combined to like kind of make that adventure flow in rapid succession. In the same way, I really liked writing the Island of Misfit Monsters because I had fun being like looking at all the monsters and then thinking, what do I want to do to make these misfits? What's the opposite of a siren? All right, we'll call it an alarm, and it keeps people away. What is the opposite of a hydra? Well, a pun would be the lodra, because it's the opposite of high, and rather than the core gimmick of the hydra, when one head gets cut off, two grow back. When one head gets cut off, another head falls off. And like that was just kind of like some very fun semantics and kind of puzzles almost in writing those. So that's my answer.
It's funny that you say, Rex, you use the word right. Because our right
loosely
is heavily improvised. But I think for me, my favorite one wasn't actually in D&D time. It was a dungeon we made on Behind the Screens with all of the paintings, and it was the painting realms. I don't know. That was just a lot of fun to like figure out what we're gonna put in each of them, and that was a fun house dungeon. And I love fun house. I love writing fun house.
And actually, if I can just throw in one more, I'm having an absolute blast right now because I am writing our adventure that we're going to run on the 21st. Because it's going to be a lot more dialogue driven than most, and I need to write it because it's going to be very complicated. And you guys should watch that as a soft plug right now for tuning in on Friday, December 21st, where we're going to run a solstice themed adventure, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. But I'm having a blast writing that right now.
Next question. Do you have a favorite boss? Also asked by Rex. I love these questions. These are good questions.
These are good questions.
Pete, you go first.
The Rhyme Slime. Easy. It's my favorite boss. I absolutely adore the Rhyme Slime. I would run him every week if I didn't think you guys would get tired of it.
That's a great question. What was mine? Bradus Deadwalker is up there. He was very fun. What else did I really love? I really loved A Coven of Two. That was a lot of fun. The Bitter
That one was
Sisters.
really good. I really liked the back and forth kind of dialogue that the Bitter Sisters did.
I actually really liked Lord of Feasts. Surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, but I actually liked that guy a lot.
The Lord of Feasts was cool.
Yeah, but I think it was Greatest Deadwalker, the train heist, way back.
I thought you were gonna pick Lemic. That was my guess for you, was Lemic, but I also liked the Nightmare Court a lot.
There have been very few bosses that I think have really flopped for me.
Yeah,
and actually for us in general.
The bosses have been consistently pretty fun.
We love boss. What was the most unexpected thing a party has ever done? Asked by Rex. Easy. In the adventure Bloodbath, they went fishing. Instead of doing the whole lead up to the battle at the end, they just went fishing instead, and it was great.
And then
amazing. I love that.
Has anyone ever completely derailed their adventure in D&DTime? I think that kind of ties into the last question.
They went fishing?
Yeah, they went fishing. And similarly, because I answered a similar question last week, mine was the Island of Misfit Monsters, where instead of slaying monsters, they just made a small farming community, and the adventure took place over like several in-game weeks of them like just doing work and trying to help establish a farming community on this small island, which I thought was delightful.
VBuddy23 has a couple questions. The first two: who does the most writing of adventures for D&DTime, and who does the most running of the games? Well, I mean, Pete, he runs 2 games each week. I run 1.
Yeah, I mean, we both write our own adventures. It's not like, and then for the big holiday events, we coordinate a little bit more. But yeah, you just basically exactly what you see in terms of people running is the exact distribution there. And what methods, skills, V-Bunny also asked, what methods, skills, or techniques do you use to keep your D&DTime adventures current, new, and exciting each week? And how do you not run out of ideas? Do you want to start this one?
I am insane, V-Bunny. That's the actual honest-to-God reason I'm a crazy person.
The answer for me is slightly more rational. I would say that I just find inspiration in very, very small things. And, D&DTime adventures, due to a degree, follow a format. We keep kind of some of the plot progression of our adventures similarly, where it's sort of like, we have some interaction phase, and then we end it with a combat. And that's how most of our adventures go. And it's finding new ways to make that interesting, that's fun. And you can make an adventure out of anything. Like, looking around my room right now, there's a stapler, and if I had to make an adventure out of a stapler, I would make some creature that's combining 2 things together in an awkward way. So I'd probably put it in the trash kingdom, and then I'd call the enemy probably the Stapler Man, which is a very rough sketch of how I would actually design an adventure. Like, that's what I do. I remember I ran an adventure once called Jacob's Ladder, based around the myth of Jacob's Ladder, but I ran that because on my way into work, I saw a guy, my neighbor, putting his ladder in his garage. Like, that's actually how I come up with my ideas.
I mean, see this little mint here? I'm going to have something based on this little mint in our next adventure. It's going to be great. But an actual, more honest answer from me, a lot of what Pete just said, the littlest things can inspire you. If someone, at any time, right, when a player says, wow, I really liked that, that for me makes a game and makes me want to do more stuff like that. And if they interacted with even just an NPC that was in the game for 15 seconds to just be like, oh, they went that away. And they're like, oh, stupid Claude, right? That makes me want to use Claude more in more D&DTime adventures, even though he was just a dwarf guard.
For sure.
Because the players engage with that character, and now it's fun, right? It's personal. And that for me is huge. Also, if players don't like something, that makes me want to never do it again. And I don't mean to BM people, but there are certain things that, if I have a really flop adventure, it's really hard for me to get back to playing that character. Like my last Sir Dan adventure did not go the way. Actually, my last one did okay.
I hope you bring Sir Dan back again, though, because I
will eventually.
Sir Dan, I actually really like. He's a delight.
It'll just take some time.
Yeah.
Who's next? Reflective 10 asks, who is best girl I don't. I mean, Selkris is the best girl. She's almost legend tier.
Yeah, she's almost legend tier.
Yeah, she's
There
the
it is.
best.
D Forgotten One asks, what kind of stuff is involved in the solstice, and who/what is the main appeal during the event? The main appeal during the event is you, the adventurers, participating in it. But after that, you'll have to wait and see, because no spoilies for Friday. We're doing some fun stuff. But I think it's going to be a good event.
This is actually a really serious question from Bionic Shiba. What's the worst case of group infighting you've had to deal with? Oh man, my last like full campaign had some serious. I wouldn't say infighting. Infighting group chemistry wasn't meshing. There were a lot of things that just weren't quite working out in the last full campaign that I've run. Not anything with DnDTime. This is a while ago, and yeah, it was pretty rough. It also wasn't helpful that their characters had very differing opinions on big like world changing effects, so that just amplified everything. It was very difficult to manage. But I guess that I don't want to go into super detail about that because I don't like focusing on the negative. But that would I think be for me.
Yeah,
and Pete, you've never had infighting.
I don't really think I've ever had to deal with that too much. I think the closest that we've ever come is in the campaign, The Crucible, that we were talking about on DnDTime Talks, is when we were all very mad at Kyle for thinking that he was going to kill for sending his son out into the frozen north. But that was more in character than it was out. That's like the most conflict I've ever had in a game. So I haven't had that many experiences in that regard.
What is your proudest plot twist as a PC or DM? Asked from Reflected 10-8. Holy shit.
I know it for both. As a PC, this was the first campaign I ever played, where I was playing this really weird scientist character that Jeremy was running this campaign. The campaign was absolutely preposterous and ridiculous. We've called it the Chaos Campaign in kind of a retrospective. But essentially, without going into all of the gritty details, I betrayed the party, which no one expected because it was my first time playing D&D, in dramatic fashion, and had, super villain style, counters to each of my group's weaknesses that I've traveled with. My favorite one is we had a player who was playing a big tree druid, and I had grown a T-Rex with weed killer in its veins to battle him, which I was a big fan of. That was my biggest twist as a PC.
My biggest twist was as a DM, and I'm simply going to describe it as the death of Bartimus, and we will come back to that at some point in the future for another talk. Crowley still has not forgiven me for that. Do you have a least favorite boss? Asked by Crowley.
I would say the answer to that question is yes, I absolutely do, but I also don't want to say what it is, because then I think it kind of feels bad for people who are in that boss fight, where it's like, oh yeah, I didn't like that one at all, that was your boss fight. So I'm just not going to say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There are always adventures that, like, I know there are a ton of them, or not a ton, a handful, I would love another swing at. That just I didn't quite execute the way I wanted.
For sure.
But yeah, there are definitely there's one in particular for me that I feel was weak.
But,
yeah. What do you have a least favorite god, and why is it Bloom from Bionic Shiba? I don't know. That's weird. It's not.
My least favorite god, I guess, is Bloom by this question, which I love him, so it feels bad that he's my least favorite. Least favorite god? Nah, I don't have a least favorite god. Yeah, what's a bad god? That rascally...
outside of DnDTime?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Like, it's like Savras, because fuck divination as like a concept.
That rascally garb glitter gold, always tricking me.
And if you could run any of your bosses again for second take, which would you and why? That's another one we're not going to answer that one, Crowley. Again, we just don't want to single anything out.
Will any bosses grow and develop into higher tier bosses?
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you right now, because I don't think this specific one is going to happen, because he's already gotten his second take. But I originally, when I made Riddle Boy as a story tiered boss, had always intended for as a Fable tier boss. Or I guess in this case, a mid-tier boss. for him to come back as Riddle Man and just be like a Riddle boy that had gone through like juvie and come out very angry. And
Brutal,
just like a Riddle boy with like tattoos, basically. And, but I don't think I'm ever going to run him. But I very much that's my one. But yeah, maybe someday.
And with that, that comes to a close of our Ask Pete and Jeremy segment. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out with us tonight. It's always amazing to have you guys here and for having you all support us. We have a ton of cool stuff coming up in the new year we're really excited about. So
there's some really cool questions this week, too. We appreciate you asking those. If you have questions that you'd like us to answer, post them in the Ask Pete and Jeremy text chat on our Discord. All of the information is linked below, Discord and our website and all the stuff that you'd need to get involved with the show if you're interested in doing so.
And don't forget, if you want to play in this week's episode of Pete and Jeremy's D&D Time, sign up.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's it. You got anything else, Jeremy?
No. Oh, I will say. Well, sorry. Yes. For you folks in the chat, as Pete kind of alluded to earlier, we are doing a solstice event this Friday. It's going to be just kind of goofy and fun. It's nothing super serious. But just for those, if there is a boss battle, it will be a themed boss battle. So just putting that out there. But that's it, though.
In that case, I'm Pete.
And I'm Jeremy.
And this is DnDTime Talks. Good night, everybody. Bye.